Hi there, and welcome to this week's edition of Upstream Ag Professional Audio Edition. My name's Shane Thomas. So this week we're going to touch on two main stories. The first one is going to be on AI-powered active ingredient discovery and really looking at some of the traction from some of the major crop protection players and how AI is being leveraged and utilized in their discovery process. And this really comes from some news this week surrounding Syngenta, which had an article in the Wall Street Journal just on their new Virustina product in Argentina and the Group 1 active called Metproxy Bicyclone. And so we'll talk a little bit about what I thought was missing from some of the conversation or some of the release commentary from Syngenta, and then we'll look at some of the other dynamics or what Bayer and UPL and Corteva have been doing, and even some of the startups, and just talk about some of the dynamics on the AI side of things for discovery. And then we're going to touch on, call it oversimplification of biostimulant sales. And I've talked a little bit about this in the past, but wanted to dive into some of the specific nuance around what makes biostimulant and arguably even biocontrol, depending on the type of product, more of its own thing rather than, I see it all the time where, it's like seed, it's consultative selling. And actually agree, it is consultative selling, but I do think that it's oversimplifying to say it's just like seed. Or I talk a lot about the similarities to crop protection, which I also think is an oversimplification in some ways as well. And so we'll talk about kind of how it pulls from all these different inputs, from fertilizer to inoculant to crop protection to seed. Before getting into those two main stories, a couple other things in this week's edition. And I call it the main story. I just didn't want to go into all the different cognitive biases. Maybe we'll do that next week. But I wrote a report, call it, on cognitive biases. And so this is something that I'm really passionate about. It's been a curiosity and an interest of mine since I was in university. For those that don't know, I was actually a psychology major originally in university before switching into agriculture. And so really have always been fascinated with how humans think. And so it's kind of drawn me into looking for improved methods for understanding the world or the agriculture industry. And so that's why I've published some of the other materials like the 33 mental models for agribusiness leaders, kind of looking at how do you better understand the world with these mental models to get up to speed faster or think more critically, whatever it might be. And I tend to believe that there's tools and systems out there to gain an edge, particularly for knowledge workers, which I think everybody listening to this is in the knowledge work profession within agriculture. And so what I did is I've been compiling the list of different biases for over a decade now, and I've read various books on it. Some have over 100 in the book. I think there's over 200 documented cognitive biases. And so I kind of pulled 40 that I reference a lot and I try to stay up on so that I can better manage how I'm thinking about a problem or how I'm thinking about a decision. And so I wanted to highlight those, what they are, why they're important, and then tie it into a agribusiness example to make sense of it, and then share some of the research. As this is what I've done in my own kind of this internal document that I had, was always trying to look for some of the research around how do you overcome this? What actions can you take to not succumb to these cognitive biases? And so I share some of that within the overview as well. So if you're interested in that, you can go check that out in the written version. And then another kind of related is I was on the Future of Agriculture podcast with Tim Hammerich, one of my favorite podcasters in ag and anywhere. I listen to it frequently, and was fortunate that Tim invited me on to talk about mental models for agribusiness leaders. So we talked about 6 or 7 different mental models and kind of the dynamics around it. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out as well. So that we'll get into the first part today, and it's what I titled I'm calling, AI powered active ingredient discovery. What traction is the crop protection industry seeing? And again, I mentioned this, alluded to some of the Syngenta news, and we'll talk about that in a second, but really to kind of start this out and look at it. In 2025, major crop protection companies invested over 7 billion in R&D. And so there's an image kind of sharing all the different companies. I've just compiled a new image with all the everywhere from the fertilizer to equipment to crop protection companies, their R&D spend for 2025. And so if you look at Bayer, Syngenta, Corteva, BASF, FMC, UPL, and New Farm, you get over 7 billion in 2025. Obviously, not all that is allocated to crop protection. If you go look at some of the old data from uh, Phillips McDougall or Egg Bio Investor, a higher percentage of that does go to seed. And so call it like a 60-40. Again, it depends on the company. I think if you look at Corteva actually had broke it out at one point, I think it was like 55% went to seed with 45 or so percent going to crop protection, just for reference. And so even with that, that still means significant dollars are invested in R&D for crop protection by these large companies, but there's a continued downward trend in new molecule discovery. There's an image I've shared multiple times. I've kind of revamped it a little bit now, but showing that downward trend across herbicides, fungicides, insecticides as well. And so if you go look at Egg Bio Investor data, this is still kind of old. I think they only publish every 5 or so years. And so I think the last data ended in 2019. And so it was showing that it takes over 12 years and more than $300 million, which is commonly referenced in the industry, to bring a product or a molecule to commercialization. It's not a new phenomenon. This is the parallel that we've observed in pharmaceuticals. So Ehrum's law is something talked about a lot. And it really is the slowing down of discovery because of it being riskier and more expensive, regulatory, all these different things. And so this is all happening while we see growth in resistance. And there's some images within the written version. Again, many of you might have seen them, but just showing how rampant resistance is. And again, we all know that, but it is definitely interesting to see it visualized, that's for sure. And so this is all to say innovation in crop protection is more necessary than ever, yet harder than ever to achieve, with more stringent regulatory environments and demand for environmental friendliness. And even this is just constantly getting harder for companies to manage. And so that's where artificial intelligence is being hailed as a savior, and it's talked about as a catalyst to reverse this stagnation. And that promise is essentially to cut R&D timelines and efficiency, improve hit rates, and guide the design of more sustainable, safer, and effective crop protection products. But I'm always curious, like, does the narrative and the story align with what we're actually seeing? And I think it's kind of interesting when you dig into it, at least from the vantage point of where I sit, where I don't have any unique backdoor insight from these companies, unfortunately. So I'm sure there's probably some more to be said. But looking at all the public information, asking questions to a lot of these different executives and leaders within the space, there's an interesting lack of examples. And so we'll get into that a little bit. But fundamentally, I think maybe to answer the question of why AI for crop protection discovery. And I think some of it's obvious, but I think it's interesting to kind of dig into a little bit more too, where crop protection companies are all increasingly using AI to help screen for billions of molecules in silico to predict their efficacy, toxicity, environmental behavior. They're using machine learning models, generative design, and retrosynthetic analysis to identify promising candidates and optimize their synthesis. And so AI offers a way to shift the R&D equation by unlocking these sort of interlinked levers of faster timelines, lower costs, and better outcomes. And so the faster discovery, essentially discovery in crop protection, has been about mass amounts of lab work, screening tens of thousands of compounds over years, hoping a few turn out to be viable or one turns out to be viable. AI changes this by shifting much of the discovery process, call it from the lab to the cloud, where you can actually do more testing more rapidly. And so virtual screening and in silico modeling can evaluate billions of potential molecules within weeks compared to hundreds physically tested over months. And protein design and target-based discovery can go a step further, where AI can identify specific vulnerabilities in pests, such as the enzymes critical for survival. So you're getting this kind of double dynamic where you can help you do the sort of Bayer crop key thing, where you identify that enzyme that's critical and then design the molecule around it. And so reverse engineer that molecule to block those targets, so to speak. So that's kind of the one faster discovery component. Then there's lower costs, which is of course hand in hand, but the average cost to bring the active ingredients to market, again, exceeds 300. It's probably higher than that, much over that now, I would expect, over the last 7 years since the last report data is from. And so AI is supposed to reduce the cost by not by cutting corners, but by improving decision making upstream in the process. So by predicting which molecules are most likely to succeed based on biological activity, toxicity, environmental persistence, and synthesis complexity, these AI tools can help R&D teams focus on the higher probability candidates earlier, which avoids wasting millions and increases optionality for R&D spend as well. And then ultimately there's the better outcomes. And so this is perhaps the most important unlock is just improved R&D success rates in combination with the above benefits. But again, these are all tied together and interlinked inherently. So AI expands the potential and it learns from data sets, including past successes and failures to uncover novel chemical scaffolds and new modes of action and can parse immense amounts of molecules, of course. And so there's something that I like to reference from Brian Lutz, VP of Agricultural Solutions at Corteva. So he shared with US Congress, I believe this was last year in 2025, just how vast the chemical universe is. I think he said it was around there's 10 to the 60th power possible molecules, which is far exceeding the number of grains of sand on Earth, which is 10 to the power of 18. So traditional screening methods can only cover a fraction of the space. And so AI is changing that discovery by enabling targeted searches for molecules that work on, again, specific pests, proteins or high specificity or environmental safety instead of relying on sort of this randomness. AI is said to bring speed, precision, and predictive design together. And so Brian Lutz shared that AI for Corteva modeled 10,000 molecules in weeks, uncovering dozens of promising new crop protection candidates that traditional methods would have missed, many of which are now in testing. AI also supports better multi-factor optimization. So in one molecule, a molecule is in one model, a molecule isn't just evaluated for efficacy, it can be evaluated on things like cost of goods, environmental safety, formulation compatibility, and regulatory fit. And so the cost of goods dynamic, I think, is huge as you can start to understand what is this going to take to scale up. And so all that plays in. And so you can start to see where these kind of combinations of things lead together to better outcomes. But it's interesting to look at what the specific company is doing, just tied a little bit into what Corteva has shared, but we'll share a little more in a bit. But one of the things that I've talked about and have had challenges is getting agribusinesses to share specific outcomes. And for clarity, nobody owes me or anybody to share this sort of information. Lots of it's going to stay public. Even publicly traded companies only have so much incentive to share certain details about what's going on in their business. If you overshare and then it doesn't come to fruition, things look bad to the markets. And so I totally respect and understand it, but there's this constant emphasis, and we'll really see it when we get to Syngenta, of all the benefits that are going to come. But then when it comes to the actual product dynamics themselves, they don't get talked about in the same context, which I think is just a weird disconnect in a lot of ways. And so we'll start with the startups before getting to the incumbents, but there's a host of startups that are looking at this, whether it's the AgPlenus or MOA or Enco or HitGen or AgriMatch or TradeSeek, which is more on the bio side of things. But all these groups are partnering with the likes of Corteva, Bayer, Syngenta, BASF, FMC. And so tons of interest in this AI side of things and these groups that have these platforms that can help support the discovery of molecules. And again, none of them, or I shouldn't say none of them, many haven't shared much for specific outcomes. And again, to be fair, I'm not trying to do this to be critical. I think it takes a long time and it's really hard to solve for these problems that are trying to be solved. We talked about the problems and how everything's decreasing, and it's not because these groups aren't working hard. It's not because they're not doing things that are trying to solve the problem. It's because it is really, really hard. And so totally respect that. But if we look at AgriMatch, they, for example, shared that they've discovered a viable herbicide candidate in under 12 months, a process that has historically taken 4 to 7 years, an 80 to 90% reduction in time. So that's obviously positive. Again, we'll see whether that comes to fruition. Go has shared that they can reduce the ability to discover new candidates to under 10 months, and they've outright stated that their Encompass platform identifies crop protection molecules 75% faster and at 90% lower cost than traditional methods. Important here to note that the discovery component is only one subset of the entire R&D and commercialization process. And so this is, I think, where these big numbers get stated, and when you hear 90% reduction from 12 years, well, obviously you're, a year and a half or 2 years or whatever that works out to. And so the reality, though, is that it's the components and the steps within that R&D process, certain ones of those are getting decreased. So when a molecule discovery reduction time is emphasized, that is only one component of the much larger process and might make up only 10 or maybe 20% of the total 12 years. And so if you start to reduce so for example, if you have an average of 12 years to bring a new molecule to market, and the initial discovery phase is reduced by 75%, and that made up 15% of the total time to bring the molecule to market, then you might see a timeline reduction of from 12 years to 11 years because you're only taking about a year and a quarter, a year or so off, which again, very positive, not trying to downplay it. I just think it's good to contextualize that when you hear these numbers, they are not necessarily 90% of the entirety of it. And so that's something that is really important. And when you start to look at the ANCOs and the MOAs of the world, where they are focused is really on that early discovery and chemistry synthesis sort of portion of the segment of the R&D process. And that is often cheaper, and that is often only about 20% of the total time and cost related to it. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Next, we'll go to the incumbents. So Bayer is a company that has acquired Targonomics and emphasized AI in improving the discovery process via their crop key approach. And so there's an image within the article, but they're one of the only groups that has specifically called out a product set to be commercialized in the next few years that was developed through an AI augmented process, and that's icafolin, a new herbicide with a new mode of action set for 2028 to be released. So interesting dynamic there. I haven't heard any of the nuanced specifics of how much shorter time it was or how much less expensive it was to bring to market, but nonetheless, it's interesting that they did very specifically call it out, which I think is smart on their end, regardless of what that number is in terms of reduced cost or speed or whatever it might be. They also have stated that they have found more than 30 potential molecular targets, and they've validated more than 10 targets as new modes of action in early research. So they're seeing a lot of opportunity according to some of the Bayer public materials. They also shared something in an investor presentation late last year that I thought was interesting. So they stated in the presentation that they're going to have fewer new AI, so active ingredient candidates, but all of them will have larger peak sales potential. So the quote really conveys that their efforts are being skewing towards specific size to progress forward, which theoretically is, I mean, makes sense for Bayer. Obviously, they're one of the largest, top two, call it, of crop protection in terms of size and scale. So they don't want to be messing around with a lot of smaller, different products necessarily. But I believe that also is interesting and that it can open up niche opportunities for others. There's a lot of groups that I've talked to, whether it's like the likes of Vive Crop Protection, or I've talked with other companies that are even on the generic side and doing some novel things where they're targeting a very specific niche application or problem set that where they bring a unique solution that is only going to ever be on, maybe it's 900,000 acres or maybe it's 5 million acres in a specific region, but they can own that and do it in a cost effective way and exploit it in a way that's profitable for them. So anyways, interesting side note there. But then we'll get to Syngenta, which is really where this kind of all stemmed from, was their news this week. And so they've actually been the most aggressive, in my opinion, anyways, in terms of the suggestions about the reduction in time to market. In 2024, they told the Wall Street Journal that AI will reduce the average time from discovery to commercialization by a third, to 10 years from 15 years, and likely decrease the number of lab and field tests by 30%. So to me, again, I'm not going to sit here and claim to be an expert and engaged in this segment every day of the week by any means, but 5 years comes across as overly optimistic. I was just assessing this from my view. I hope I'm wrong, to be honest, but given how regulatory and physical field trials have been the more significant time and cost growth in bringing new products to market, it seems more likely that a win from R&D, AI and R&D discovery would simply mean that we do not continue to increase how long it takes molecules to get to the market. A decrease would be fantastic. I hope that this is right, from 15 years to 10. That'd be fantastic. Even a couple years is obviously very beneficial in getting products to market for farmers or saving costs, and so very beneficial. But from my point of view, I sit here and I look at it and I'm like, even if we stop extending that out, that's a win and that's beneficial from what AI is delivering. And so even in other public materials, Syngenta suggested that the decrease can happen from complete automation of assay assessment, 400% increase in throughput by removing manual scoring, documentation, and data analysis. They say 80% reduction in false negatives, 30% reduction in time to result, 25% reduction in the number of required replicates, and an overall increase in insights gained through some of the assays. And so the thing with Syngenta is that they have not publicly qualified any of this with a product in their pipeline today. And again, it might be there, they just haven't got the approvals to talk about it publicly. So again, I totally respect that. But if you do go look at where they have tried to emphasize this, if you go to some vague press releases with Anko from late 2024, it was like December, I think, that if what they stated to be true, which is reducing discovery to commercialization by 30%, that doesn't appear to be happening in the instance of what they shared with Anko based on my calculations from that December announcement. And so when you start to look at it, it actually was still in line with the exact same sort of timeline that we would have seen, which again, not a knock. If it's not going up, that's beneficial. That's fantastic. But it's interesting when you look at this collaboration and their timelines of when they're hitting milestones and what that looks like are actually perfectly or very closely aligned with what we would have expected to see over the last couple decades. In this month, in the Wall Street Journal, Syngenta shared their news on that Virustina product, so the metproxy bicyclone, and which is a group one. Seems like a really interesting product. You have your DIMS, DENS, FOPs typically in the group one. This is a new subsegment or family within that group, which is obviously very beneficial. So it's great to see that Syngenta's commercializing products that are net positive, net new for the industry. But notably, in my mind anyway, Syngenta had the perfect opportunity to quantify how many years it took this product to get to market and how AI explicitly impacted that, but they didn't. And to me, that suggests that it might not have been impacted at all by AI, which is interesting in some regards. I think if we go look at the actual public materials, so you can see that they first applied for the patent on MetProxy in 2015, I think is what I saw. And so with the first launch expected for Argentina this year, so 2026, that indicates 11 years from patent to commercialization. And there was likely at least 2 years or more on the front end of getting that molecule in a position to successfully get a granted patent, which means something like 13 years. Again, I'm speculating on that too. Maybe it was less than 2 years, maybe it was 6 months, maybe it was 5 years. I don't know. But even if it's 6 months, even if it was 3 months, it's basically aligned with where we are currently at. And I think to be fair, this is still a molecule that was in the beginning of its R&D process before the major AI improvements we've witnessed over the last 4 years. So it might not have been impacted all that much, but it's still notable to me that they have not been public in sharing any specific product details and how AI has changed the economics of bringing that molecule through the commercialization process. So anyways, that's kind of the core driver and something I find fascinating surrounding this news. To get into the Wall Street Journal and then just basically say we used machine learning to help discover this product, I think doesn't do justice to some of the other claims that they've made previously in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. Going back to Corteva, they've shared some examples, which again, not to specific products, but if you go to their 2024 Investor Day, and they've kind of talked about this in various public conversations and presentations, but they've talked about how AI is accelerating their R&D process. So they say that 1,000x increase in speed of identifying molecular structures for biologicals. I think they said something like a 7x reduction in cost on the biological front. They've expanded their small molecule discovery. They've 100x increased in the development of non-technical documents for regulatory submission. So they're using it for regulatory, which is the same as how UPL has, the only way UPL has talked about it is primarily around kind of the regulatory dossiers. Again, they probably are using it in the R&D process. I'm only going off of what I can publicly cite where it's been stated. Otherwise, I'm just speculating. So in a 2026 investor conference, Corteva did elaborate how they're using it, and again shared that 1,000x. Chuck McGrow talked about kind of this haystack metaphor, which I thought was really useful, where he basically said that is we used to be trying to find a needle in a haystack with the amount of compounds we have to comb through, and it was very manually based. Now with AI, it's like having a massive magnet that can actually just suck the needle out of the haystack. So anyways, I thought it was a well articulated metaphor. But The other side of things, they've talked about it from regulatory submission. And even in this same conference on the seed side, they talked about how they're using it from like a coordination perspective to understand the demand for parent seed and where they're going to produce and all that, which I think is a really unique utilization for AI and really helping. Again, this goes back to some things, which is goes back to one of the earliest books I read on AI is really using it as a coordination layer. And I think you see that talked about a lot more now, but I think that really reinforces it as a coordination layer there. So that's interesting. And then Corteva also has a relationship with Eggplenus. So they have a pipeline coming through there. FMC's talked about it, much less so in terms of what they're seeing. But he basically said, FMC and Pierre Brondeau, CEO, basically said, we now have a process where we are much more strict on the decision to hold it in the pipeline in discovery. And so basically saying they're a little bit more efficient, which talked a little bit about before. But there's still some challenges with AI and the shortcomings. And again, AI is going to be super helpful. I think if you go talk to anybody in R&D, they probably have found a bunch of benefits to it. But despite that optimism and the effort, there's still some hurdles around it. And this is from talking to a bunch of different people, reading some different papers, but there's still a lack of high quality pest specific data sets. And so AI models are only as good as the data they're trained on and used for. And so in crop protection, that means needing large structured data sets that capture things like the chemical data. So molecular structures, ADME profiles. There's the need for physiological data, so target proteins, resistant pathways and pests, and then environmental data, so UV exposure, pH, humidity effects, all these different things. Unlike pharmaceuticals, where massive curated data sets exist for human biology, crop protection discovery has this sort of fragmented, incomplete dynamic. And again, not that there's nothing there, it's just this is a little bit more fragmented and it limits the model across pest types and geographies and delivery environments, making it harder to predict efficacy or toxicity in the real world relative to like a pharmaceutical. Related to this, there's even most commercial chemical libraries are optimized for drug-like properties such as human bioavailability or oral dosing or low toxicity in mammals. These compounds often lack physiochemical properties needed for foliar application or cuticle penetration in plants or insects. They break down too easily in the environment. So that can also be another thing that it's challenging to model. And so as a result, AI models trained on these libraries can recommend molecules that are safe and active in silico, but fail in trials due to environmental instability or poor pest specificity. And so again, this is all being worked on, but I think it just shows that there are still some challenges. And I think it really goes to this thing that we've seen in, call it the data and software side of the world, where the reality is that farming happens in an uncontrolled environment, which can limit some of the impact AI can deliver. Just like you try to predict yield or you try to do pest prediction, yeah, these models are helpful, but if you're 95% effective, you're still only 95% effective on yield. That's still a lot of people are going to be within that range, or there's just things you can't account for when it comes to weather, like a derecho coming through and blowing over all of your corn, which you might have had a 250 bushel yield prediction. It might have been within 5 bushels, but all of a sudden that happens. And so you end up with, if you took that data and ended up making a marketing decision off of it, well, you might not end up with that many bushels. And so you could be short on what you contracted. And so anyway, there's a lot of different dynamics that come in here. And I think to bring it back to the AI and in discovery, so you have these in silico predictions don't translate easily to in vivo success. And so the computational models can simulate binding affinity or toxicity well, but in the real world, multiple unmodeled variables can interfere. So you have delivery with, again, does it stick to the leaf, penetrate the pest, survive in the spray tank? Metabolism, how does the pest metabolize the compound? Does it deactivate too quickly? The environmental fate, all these different things that kind of fit into that. And so that's kind of the core of still some of the challenges. And again, these are probably being worked on and being fixed, but there's other areas that come in too, which this is all on top of effectively being able to identify that molecule. But then there's the regulatory dynamics, which is something I've talked about before. And I love the model or the kind of theory of constraints, which is a concept developed by Ellie Goldratt. And so he has a book called The Goal. If you haven't read it, very good for thinking about constraints and systems and efficiency and that sort of thing. But he talks about focusing on identifying the weakest link or a constraint in a process or a system to improve the overall system performance. optimizing other segments of the chain without addressing the weakest link fails to improve overall performance and can sometimes decrease efficiency even more. And so if you think about, there's the image that's in the written version, but there's, call it, 7 different kind of components. Again, depending how you break it out, there's probably more in the discovery process. But if you can speed up 3 of the components around the R&D and commercialization process, but there's still challenges with the fourth or fifth component or both, we do not necessarily see a decreased time to commercialization. And if we think about it from through the molecule discovery and commercialization, where target discovery is one thing, but the constraints that drive the time and costs up are often beyond that portion of the R&D process, such as the toxicology testing or the environmental fate testing, the field trial work. And so all are required for regulatory approvals. And so all of that shows that all of a sudden regulatory becomes an even bigger constraint. And if all of a sudden you were to start to see an increase in the number of molecules that were getting to that point, all of a sudden you're overloading that constraint even more, because now you need to have more people to do the research. You need to have the regulatory to be able to handle all these. And so again, I'm kind of extrapolating, which might not be entirely accurate, but you can start to see where this theory of constraints can apply to AI discovery in ag. And so overall, I'll stop rambling about this now, but it is a really fascinating topic, and I'm sure many of you listening have much more experience in this segment. So if there's anything that you see differently, I would love to hear from you and talk about it. Fundamentally, AI is going to improve crop protection R&D, seed and trait R&D, but the promise still, I think, remains really intangible in some ways as to exactly where and what this is going to look. Because at the end of the day, if I look at what the outcome is of AI, it's like either for, meaning specifically in the R&D process, the outcome either needs to be, or in combination needs to be, more products to farmers, cheaper costs to farmers, or higher margins and more products for the company themselves to sell. And so if you're not seeing those actual implications, then there's only so much value that's being derived. Of course, you can cut out some of the costs by doing some work that would have taken 17 researchers or something. So there's a component there that could fit the benefit of margins. But if we think about it, you look at the average crop protection company, they're spending, call it 8% on R&D, 8% of revenue on R&D. And so if you cut out 10% of that, you're at 0.8 of that kind of cost of what's going into a business. That's not quite the right math, but you can start to see where I'm going, where if you still have the, call it, commercialization, so SG&A expense, that call it 18%, something like that, but that actually goes up because now you actually might have different products that you have to sell in a different way. And so my point is more, you can cut out a little bit of the R&D, but that's only going to be so beneficial in terms of total costs and helping margins. And so it's not like the cost to the farmer are necessarily going to drop. I mean, if anything, they might actually increase because you're bringing new molecules that are now branded, IP protected. And so anyways, but at the end of the day, the goal in my view is, how do you have better tools and more tools that a farmer can use? So I don't want to get too hung up on cost side of things, but that's fundamentally where I start to think about all these different things. I think there's hopefully going to be more quantifiable examples coming in the next, call it, 36, 48, 60 months would be great to hear more about what's going on in the segment. And so with that, we'll move to the last part of the audio version today. And this comes from I thought a really well done article. It is on LinkedIn called "More Acres, More Competition, Less Margin, the Biological Trap No One Talks About." And I think there is a lot of talk about the things the individual covers. He talks about, commoditization and differentiation, which are things that I know many people, I've talked about it for 5+ years in Upstream on the biological side of things. And so there's people that do talk about it, but it probably doesn't get the attention it deserves, and the ability to think through that commoditization process and what does differentiation look like. And I actually, just for reference, I took the Dunham Trimmer report that I broke down call it a month ago, and turned that into a video for anybody that wants to watch it, didn't want to read, or missed it, whatever it might be. There's an audio component as well too. So if you want to listen to that kind of talks on some of the dynamics, as Dunham Trimmer has talked about that same commoditization dynamic for a number of years as well. And so I do think that this individual kind of nailed some of those dynamics around, hey, there's a need to really think about commoditization, differentiation in unique ways. But he said something on the selling process, and this is something that always stands out to me, because I think he's not the only one that talks about it like this, and I don't think it's inherently wrong, but the comment he shares is on the selling process. around, he says biologicals. I think it's important to be very specific. Are we talking biocontrol? Are we talking biofertilizer? Are we talking biostimulant? Whatever. I'm thinking about it from a biostimulant perspective specifically, although there is commonality, of course, between all those different products. But just to be more specific, I think it's important to call out it'll be biostimulants in this example. And so the comment that he shared or wrote was selling a biological product is far closer to selling premium seed than to selling a fungicide. It requires a long sales process and a consultative approach, expectation management, post application follow up, and confidence built across multiple seasons, not a single visit. So I do tend to agree with that. And I don't disagree with the sentiment of biologicals being like seed, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So there's, because to me, I'm not arguing, it is a consultative approach to selling biologicals and biostimulants, but so is almost any input sale, in my opinion, in the industry. I think it's just an oversimplification to say it's like selling seed. And then, in fact, if you look at the reference to fungicide that he shared, to me, supporting a farmer on a fungicide decision, at least in my experience, requires all of the things the author listed surrounding seed as well. And so you need to go out there and do post-application follow-up to see what the efficacy was like. You need to have expectation management. If you think there's going to be no disease, if you go tell somebody, hey, you're spraying a fungicide and they expect to see zero leaf disease on their soybean or on their wheat or whatever it might be, they're probably going to have a bad experience. And I think I got to witness this with how people where I started out as an agronomist used to sell half rate tilt or propiconazole based products and basically just say, yeah, go put it in with your herbicide at 3-leaf. And the farmer expected the crop to have no disease on it indefinitely, when we know that propiconazole does not persist in new material, leaf material that comes out. And so anyways, I think there's a ton that needs to go into having the right sort of conversation about fungicides and every crop protection product. But the core of my kind of qualm with this, and this is not specific to this individual's writing, I actually like a lot what he shared in this. I think it's just this desire to put products into an input box, quote unquote, like seed or fertilizer or crop protection, but none of the frameworks alone fully capture what it takes for broad scale success in that segment. And so if we look at seed, for example, biostimulants do require a consultative, operation specific selling process, one that accounts for the nuance of the specific operation, trust establishment, and continued engagement after the application. But using the hierarchy of agronomic needs, which is something I have talked about quite a bit, and again, it's imperfect, but I think it gives a good baseline for how to think about the input segment and how farmers, on average, again, I'm generalizing, think about it. But seed is a foundational input that is the most tangible of all inputs with clear performance metrics, which is often different than biostimulants, which highlights alone the shortcoming of it as a standalone comparison. So if we just think about seed, it has effectively 100% treatment intensity rate on annual crop acres because everybody has to put seed onto the ground or you don't have a crop, obviously. That means farmers know they are going to purchase seed. It is simply a matter of which one. Stimulants, on the other hand, are probably only around, again, depends on region, crop, all these different things, but call it a 15-ish% treatment intensity in large-scale row crops across North America. Plus, the outcomes are inherently less tangible. The applications are more challenging. Tank mixing, timing, those sorts of things are a challenge. And they're often used in response to the environment. And therefore, budget is not always penciled in, which means there's inherently more that needs to be looked at to be successful in biostimulants. And that's what brings me to the crop protection example, where I've frequently suggested biostimulants should be positioned and sold similar to crop protection, and I still believe the analogy holds value. Crop protection products are positioned for a specific problem, or should be for a specific problem, whether it's a specific weed, a specific disease, a specific insect. So you're using them in response to a very specific, call it stimulation or call it elicitation or event or problem or intervention need. And biostimulants, in my view, are best positioned by honing in on one or two well-defined functions, whether it's a specific abiotic stress reduction or a specific nutrient that it enhances the uptake of or the efficiency of. And so this allows the specific problem a biostimulant is solving for to be made top of mind and tangible to the farmer, which can align value to the problem and anchor their focus on a specific outcome. And so it gives the product a distinct place in the crop planning cycle or problem identification aspects within the farm. And so this builds a good foundation, but I also recognize this as shortcomings too, because there is this need to be not just reactive, but thinking about this and getting farmers to think proactively about it. And so, but then there's even more, where if we look at inoculants, so the next consideration for me is sort of the operational and logistical challenges and dealing with an additional product, especially in the instance of, say, a microbial biostimulant or a living product, or one that just has nuance in how it needs to be mixed or handled or whatever it is. It brings more complexities that are like inoculants and mirrors perishable goods. So again, just brings more things that need to be considered and worked on and thought through. And so they require placement consideration throughout the value chain and application and shelf life considerations and handling practices that ag retailers and farmers might be less equipped for as well. And then we can get into fertilizer, which arguably fertilizer sales processes have a fit too. So selling a premium fertilizer product, such as, say, Micro Essentials, for example, requires a deeper understanding of the soil and the interaction between the soil parameters and the premium fertilizer features and the specific crop that you're putting it on. And so in many instances, a detailed soil understanding often more valuable than is required with seed. Again, you need to understand the soil for seed, but there's this more nuanced detail required. And so it's necessary to derive great outcomes with biostimulants to understanding that soil in detail. And so this is where, when I think about biostimulants and selling, and for background, I think I first sold biostimulants in 2009. Uh, very passionate about them. Was someone that got told these are stupid, these don't work, these are snake oil, you're a snake oil salesman, at many different times. And again, that wasn't the only thing I was selling by any means. It was just something that I was really drawn to because of the complexity. And when you read the data, they're really fascinating. And I think there's a ton of potential. It's just about doing a better job of understanding the context of the farm and the operator and the product itself and the environmental problems that persist and are there that need to be managed. And so when I think about biostimulants, they require a system selling. And so they are not just another product to bolt onto existing systems. They require holistic integration into agronomic systems and a recombination of capabilities from various other input segments to ensure biostimulants as a category are successful. And so you need to have the sales teams that do adopt a consultative approach and an agronomically aligned approach with what is going on with that farmer, or they risk getting drowned out in a feature fight, so to speak. And so this is not quite like seed, sort of like crop protection, sort of like fertilizer, but inherently unique. And so your marketers must create targeted function specific messaging or risk being lost in an ocean of products. We've all seen the, call it, 500 number of biostimulants on the mixing bowls landscape map of biostimulants. And so that's one thing. I think formulators and operations teams need to consider packaging and shelf life and handling assets and how that all ties into the successful sale and utilization. I was just talking with a friend the other day that works for a crop input company, and they're looking at integrating biostimulants into their seed treatments. The need to really consider, who do you target, what assets do they have, all these different things are very, very important. So anyways, it just reinforces the point. But agronomists do need to apply systems thinking, not a bolt-on mentality, which is how we often kind of see crop protection products thought about, because they can just plug into whatever given system. Generally, again, you might have some resistance management considerations or some next year cropping challenges that you need to consider, but fundamentally they're a little bit simpler to deploy. But if you want to ensure the best outcomes in conjunction with other inputs, you need to think about the practices and everything in conjunction with one another. And so to me, success will come to those companies that can integrate the knowledge infrastructure, the capabilities, the selling process that will actually integrate these disciplines cohesively rather than forcing biostimulants into some legacy input sales framework. And so I think that's really key. And if you're interested, I won't get into it today for length, but I have put together like the biostimulant playbook, which again, it's imperfect, but I think it provides a framework for thinking about how do you begin to sell these products or position these products in a way that is actually going to add value to the farmer. Because again, we're talking about selling stuff to the farmer, but fundamentally, it's about understanding what problem that farmer has that maybe is going unaccounted for or unmanaged today. And that's where the biostimulant products, I believe, are a great fit and have a really compelling future potential in the industry across many different crops, many different regions, and I'm sure there'll be many companies that are successful with it. And so with that, I'll leave it there. But as always, if you have any questions, comments, or anything like that, please reach out, Shane at upstream.ag. And with that, I hope you have a great rest of your week.